Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Unit 8 and 9. This PowerPoint is going to cover Unit 8, topics 8.1 to about 8.5. So let's just dive right in. Okay, so even before the Second World War had ended, the big three, that's Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, were meeting up to discuss what the world was going to look like after it was all over. We talked about two of the meetings, the Yalta Conference of February 1945 and the Potsdam Conference of July 1945, really in the last unit, but we didn't hit the Tehran Conference. So here's some new information and a refresher. In November of 1943, they met in Iran and they decided that the Soviet Union would focus on freeing the eastern part of Europe, while Britain and the US would team up on the western part of Europe. They also all agreed to a demand the Soviets made that Soviet Russia would get some of the Polish land. And as a way to make it equal for Poland, Poland would get some land from Germany when all was said and done with the war. Basically, this is what was called the Curzon Line. Do you see that up here, this little picture? This was a line drawn after World War One, but there was a lot of disagreements about it until World War Two when Stalin got his way. So these pink areas, these were former pre-World War Two provinces of Germany that were transferred to Poland after the war. The gray area is pre-World War Two Polish territory east of the Curzon Line, annexed by the Soviet Union after the war. Now, we remember the Yalta Conference. FDR wanted free democratic elections in Eastern Europe, but Stalin, actually living there, wanted more control there and wanted it as a buffer, just in case Germany decides to rear its ugly head again. In the Potsdam Conference, FDR had passed away and was replaced by VP Harry Truman, while the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Winston Churchill, was replaced by Clement Attlee when Churchill lost the election. Truman held on to FDR's initial want of free elections, but Stalin had more power. And in a way, he felt as though he had more power than the other two. He hadn't lost an election, and he was still alive. And he had troops in Eastern Europe. So he says no, and he gains control of East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. This is going to start a battle of trust between the two major powers. Before the wars, Europe, we know, was a world power. But afterwards, due to all the destruction that took place in Europe, the power is going to shift to the United States and Russia. Yes, the Soviet Union did lose a good 10 to 20% of its population, but they did not lose its infrastructure, while Germany, France, and England did. And the US, they came out definitely on top. There were great things to come for the war, and the tea from spice tea technology, we have to touch upon that. We do not have air pressure cabins in your airplane cabin. We wouldn't have those if it weren't for the war. We wouldn't have refrigeration or even the widespread use of penicillin. We also wouldn't have gone to the moon. So if you watch popular movies like Captain America Winter Soldier or the recent show Hunters on Amazon, which is fairly violent, or the show For All Mankind on Apple TV, you may have heard about something called Operation Paperclip or Operation, and excuse my terrible Russian, Osaya. So I know we talk about how terrible the Germans were, but you have to understand other countries did some terrible things too. The United States and the Russians both ended up recruiting German scientists who did terrible things to Jewish people and Roma people and gay people and any person who was deemed not fit by the Germans. They essentially gave them new identities to help both the United States and the Russians in the arms race and the space race. The United States would end up recruiting 1,600 scientists, like people like Werner von Braun, and the Soviets would recruit 2,200. But they were a little more aggressive in their tactics, as in the Soviets would actually do it at gunpoint. But even though these people were guilty of war crimes, we would give them a new identity just to have them come over here and fight for us. And by fight, I mean help us build rockets to go to the moon. Anyway, these meetings resulted in tensions, and these tensions are going to build. Those meetings I was just talking about. Instead of another all-out war, they're going to settle into what is known as the Cold War, which doesn't have a direct military confrontation, but rather it's going to play out in propaganda campaigns, secret operations, an arms race, and proxy wars, which we're going to get into. They're both going to develop a hydrogen bomb, which was a third generation nuclear weapon that used an atom bomb as a trigger. It was more compact in size but created more destruction. It is basically 1,000 times the power of an atomic bomb. By 1961, President Dwight Eisenhower was actually concerned, and remember, he's a military guy, that the military industrial complex, this idea that the government and large defense contractors were going to gain too much power over time. He was actually ahead of his time, too, because in this regard, because of his fear of countries stockpiling nuclear weapons, it actually becomes a reality. India, Pakistan, North Korea, they're all creating and stockpiling bombs. And because of this war, we're going to have a breakdown of all these empires. Countries are so busy fighting that they're not paying attention to the anti-colonial movements that are going to start to build. We hit on the revolutions in Russia and China and Mexico in our prior unit. They're not the only ones that are going to hit back at governments in power. Countries that were imperialized are going to fight back starting after World War II. So, the Cold War is going to boil down to a difference between capitalism and communism. These are two different economic policies and political theories. Here's a refresher in case you forgot. In capitalism, the country's industry is controlled and maintained by private owners for profit. There's freedom, ideally, and people act in their own self interest. In communism, Karl Marx said that as a result of class warfare, the rich versus the poor, property would end up being publicly owned, and every person would work and be paid according to their abilities and needs. In a capitalist society like the United States, we tend to be democratically swayed and we elect our leaders. In a communist society like the USSR, the elections are not significant because there's typically just a single party. And in the USSR, it was called the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and it was founded in 1912 by the Bolsheviks. We like to make connections to today, and there could be arguments made that Russia is sliding back to this form of government. They changed from the USSR to Russia in 1991. However, with the election of Vladimir Putin as president in 2000, things have started to fall back. He served in that position until 2008, when he did then what is known as a tan democracy. It's just the word democracy with the word tan in front of it, with a man named Dmitry Medvedev. Basically, Medvedev switches to president while Putin becomes prime minister, because Putin couldn't run for a consecutive third term. And while the prime minister is usually more of a subservient position, Putin basically makes himself the leader of the country. Then in 2012, Putin runs for president and wins, while Medvedev becomes his prime minister. So they just switched jobs again. He's still the president, and just the other day he said he was president until 2024, and he made some reforms that upset Medvedev, causing the government to resign. But all he did was just reappoint a whole new government. And in fact, just today, I read that he's essentially made himself president until 2036. So, the 1936 Constitution of the USSR, just a few things that we should talk about, because here I say women's equality, actually guaranteed equality for women. It says in Article 122, women in the USSR are accorded equal rights with men in all spheres of economic, state, cultural, social, and political life. So during the Soviet Union's participation in World War II, many women became widowed, making them more likely to become impoverished. As men were called away to assist with the fighting, women would step in. Some took charge of state farms and large collective farms. In 1942, women made up over half of the agricultural labor force. Soviet women not only assumed roles in industry and agriculture, around 8,400 girls joined the Red Army or the Soviet Navy. The first woman to fly in space actually was Russian. She was selected for more than 400 applicants. She piloted the Vostok 6 mission on June 16, 1963. In order to actually become a cosmonaut, she had to be honorarily inducted into the Soviet Air Force. And technically, she became the first civilian to fly in space. She flew for 3 days, and she actually performed various tests on herself to collect data. In 1977, Soviet Constitution actually supported women's rights both in public life and in the family life. But there's a caveat. The Constitution contains a degree of contradiction. Although it ensures a woman's right to education in the workforce and in the family, the emphasis on motherhood as the essential calling of women is it's very strong. So while they like to say that they were better at many things, they would also kind of hit at us when it comes to the discrimination against African Americans and other minorities in our country. They still had this whole women should be very educated, but come on, make some babies. There's always a plus and a negative. So each side thinks it's better than the other, and they want to spread their influence. The Soviets are going to spread into other countries in Eastern Europe and develop their 5 year economic plans there in their satellite countries. They would only allow communist political parties there as well. The idea of a satellite country meant that these smaller countries were wholly reliant on the USSR. This is this picture up here on the top left. These like these satellite countries that they had, kind of their buffer zone. This also brings in this whole new vernacular, these new descriptors that ended up taking over for a long, long time. We have what is known as the First World, which we use to describe the United States and its allies. The Second World, which was what the Soviet Union and its allies and satellite countries were called. And unfortunately, the term the Third World, which were known as non aligned countries. These terms are typically coming out of our vernacular these days, just so you're aware. Anyway, non-aligned countries wanted to stay out of the US-Soviet Cold War. These were countries in Africa and Asia, and they weren't dominated by the two superpowers. These countries held a conference in Indonesia, and they passed resolutions condemning colonialism, which is an obvious thing to condemn. They held a conference called the Bandung Conference, Bandung, which essentially states that the non-aligned movement, or they started it rather in 1961. Today, the countries of the non-aligned movement are nearly two-thirds of the United Nations members and 55% of the world population. They want to govern their countries without the main capitalist powers, nor the major socialist states telling them how to do it. Some people in the non-aligned movement you want to familiar yourself with would be an individual named Sukarno in Indonesia, Sukarno, and Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. So I'm going to spell that out for you. Kwame, Kwame, and his last name is Nkrumah. So let me tell you a little bit about Sukarno. Sukarno was the first president of Indonesia after he was the leader for independence against the Dutch. So think about this. Indonesia is now a colonial piece of Dutch, like their own land. But he's then going to get them to be independent. So he actually worked with the Japanese during World War II because Japan had invaded Indonesia during the war and freed him. But once Japan surrendered, he managed to secure independence for Indonesia. He's important because he actually formed the non-aligned movement with Egypt's president Gamal Abdel Nasser, India's prime minister Pandit Nehru, Yugoslavia's president Josip Broz Tito, and Ghana's president Kwame Nkrumah. He actually established an autocratic government in 1959 and made sure the country was stable and managed to get help from the Soviet Union and China by steering his country towards communism. He provided support for the Communist Party in the country, which was called the Communist Party of Indonesia, aka it was known as the PKI. But in 1965, there was what is known as the 30 September movement, which led to the execution of its members and many massacres, with around 500,000 to 1,000,000 people who died. He was replaced by a general and was put under house arrest until his death. Now, over to the Kwame Nkrumah guy. He was the first prime minister and president of Ghana in 1960 after Ghana declared independence from Britain in 1957. Do you remember the Berlin Conference? Do you remember how Africa was completely split up? Well, Ghana was a part of Britain. We took it. So he then declares independence. He was an influential advocate for a term called Pan-Africanism and a founding member of the Organization of African Unity. In 1964, a constitutional amendment made Ghana a one-party state with Nkrumah as president for life, but 2 years later he was deposed and he lived the rest of his life in Ghana. Despite all of this, the Soviets had this major goal of spreading communism everywhere. Well, the US also has a major goal of not letting communism spread any farther than it already has, a policy that they call containment. This is going to turn America into the world's police, if you've ever heard of that term before. The idea of containment is going to influence the Truman Doctrine, which is a statement. That's all. It's just a statement, essentially. That means the US will do anything it can do to stop the spread, specifically in Greece and Turkey. Look up at this map up here on the top right. Look how close it is to Europe. Well, the Soviets wanted to put down military bases and control all the water around that area. Do you remember the Crimean War and getting back to all those warm water ports? That's what Russia wants to do. So, President Truman in 1948 says that he will make sure the U.S. gives economic and military support to those two countries, to resist any communist domination. Another way the U.S. helped was through the Marshall Plan, which came around in June 1947. If I'm giving you a lot of dates, it might be really helpful after you take all your notes to really write down a timeline, just so you know, because we're going to jump around a little bit. So, the Marshall Plan, America's going to give $12 billion in aid to help revitalize all the nations in Europe, to help rebuild their countries. The Soviets wouldn't let their satellite countries take any money, and they even came up with their own plan. It was called the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance to help out Eastern Europe. And it helped some, but not nearly as much as the Marshall Plan. So, oh, I should probably go back just a little bit because I added some space people here. All this is going on as the Soviets and the US are trying to go to space. The Soviets will be the first to launch a satellite into space in 1957. That's this little thing up here. It's called Sputnik. With the US, they're going to do it in 1958. In 1958, we're also going to create NASA. I've got a little bit of just extra information here that you don't really need to know, but I just thought it was so much fun. So just give me a second here. All right. So the idea to explore out space, like that was what we originally wanted to do. President Eisenhower, the president who signs NASA into existence, also created two national security oriented space programs that would operate at the same time as NASA. One would work under the Air Force as a means to see if we could militarize space, something our current administration is wanting to do now. So remember, this is not a new idea. And the second was a secret organization only uncovered in the 1990s called the National Reconnaissance Office. And it was codenamed, get ready, Corona. I'm not even joking. I can't even make this up. We literally called it Corona. And it's March of 2020, and we know the coronavirus is going on right now, so everything's just really funny. Can't help it. Anyway, the idea of Corona was to use orbiting satellites to gather intelligence on the Soviet Union. The whole space race evolved just from the arms race, which was building weapons. They were so busy developing missiles that at a certain point they both realized they could essentially destroy each other, no matter who started the war. This is a term called mutually assured destruction. All right. So, while the US was competing with the Soviets in space, the Europeans had to worry about the Soviets right next door. So, as a means to protect themselves, they joined up and created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, called NATO, in 1949, which was basically a way to pledge mutual support and cooperation towards one another. Essentially, these countries had each other's backs in the event of a war. The Soviets' response was the Warsaw Pact, created in 1955. All the countries that joined were basically called the Communist Bloc, BLOC. Now, it's important to know what's going on in Germany during this time. So the first slide had a picture of the Berlin Wall. And so we should all know about that, but you should also know that between 1945 and 1949, Germany was split into what are known as 4 occupation zones. Up here on the top left, we have Germany, just so you have a visual. This idea of the 4 occupation zones was agreed upon at the Potsdam Conference. In 1949, do you see how we have Great Britain owns this part, France owns this part, the United States owns this part, and this part is owned by the USSR. So, in 1949, England, the US, and France all let their pieces join together and self-govern as one. while Eastern Germany was still controlled as a satellite country under the USSR. Not only was Germany split, but so was Berlin, which was in the middle of East Germany. It was split into four occupied zones, and it too came together in 1949. These three parts versus this one part. However, in 1961, East Berlin closed the border basically at midnight in August and started building a wall and kept it closed off until 1989. It wasn't just a wall either. There was a land leading up to the wall where there was a barbed wire and guards, and they could shoot you if they caught you trying to cross. It was about 150 to 200 people that were caught and shot, unfortunately. It was pretty bad. The wall officially, totally, completely came down in 1991. So, proxy wars were wars that were fought by countries almost as if on behalf of the big powers. For instance, and you're going to have to watch Drake dance here for Vix. We've got a lot to talk about. The Korean War, which was North Korea invading South Korea. The North had support from the Soviets and China, and the South had support from the United Nations and most of the United States. So I have a line here. This is North Korea and South Korea on this bottom right picture. All right, this war starts in 1950 and ends in 1953. At the end of World War II, the USSR and the US liberated Korea from Japan, because remember, Japan takes over it. And Korea was split at what is known as the 38th parallel into two zones of occupation. Soviets got the North, Americans got the South. There were many battles, many deaths, and on July 27, 1953, they signed an armistice, which said they would create a demilitarized zone, which still exists today. No peace treaty exists. They're still technically at war. They just don't fight. 3 million people died for a war where nothing changed. The North wanted to reunify all of Korea under communism, but nothing resulted from this war other than death. Vietnam had been under French control, and during World War II, Japan invaded. In order to fight off both the Japanese and the French, this political leader named Ho Chi Minh, H-O space C-H-I space M-I-N-H, formed a group, the League for Independence of Vietnam, known as the Viet Minh, V-I-E-T space M-I-N-H. So Japan leaves after they lose the war, leaving the French in control. But Ho Chi Minh's forces see a chance to take over, and they declare the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the city of Hanoi. These are all little details, but I use them because you may have heard of places like Hanoi before, or you will in the future. Both France and Mr. Minh want a unified Vietnam, so they both have a shared goal. France wants more of a westernized Vietnam, and Minh wants a communist Vietnam. The war starts in 1954, but doesn't end until 1975. Vietnam was unified in 1976 as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, and only in the 1990s did the United States and Vietnam start trading again. Around 2 million Vietnamese died. The US kept fighting because of the fear of the domino theory. Their idea was if one Southeast Asia country falls to communism, they all will. You'll learn a lot more in American history, like the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that gave the president broad war-making powers, all the protests against the war in this country, the Tet Offensive, the My Lai massacre, and the Kent State shooting. Many Vietnam vets today do not like to discuss what went on over there, and I've included a clip in one of the next slides that you can watch in your own time. It's only about 2 minutes, because this was a war that many Americans would sit down while eating dinner, and they would watch while the news was going on, and this is actually what changes public opinion against the war. So, one of the effects of the Cold War was a civil war in Angola, which was a colony of Portugal. And Angola is right up here in this top picture of Africa. It's the shaded part in case you're colorblind, but it's like a red. This started after they got independence in 1975 and was yet another proxy war between the Soviet Union and the United States. This war lasted until 2002. It was kind of split into 3 periods of fighting where 500,000 people died and 1 million people were basically displaced from their homeland. It destroyed infrastructure, the economy, and religious institutions. This is just foreign countries getting involved, trying to push their own agendas. Whew, here we go. The Sandinista-Contras conflict. Now this needs a little bit of backstory. This has to do with Nicaraguan revolution. Yes, yet another revolution. But this one takes place in the 1970s. So, The Somoza family is this autocratic family dictatorship in Nicaragua that lasted from 1936 to 1979. Opposition to their leadership starts to rise up in the 1960s and 1970s, and it boils to a head in 1978 when a violent campaign is started and led by a group known as the Sandinista National Liberation Front. So they do some terrible human rights abuses, and US President Jimmy Carter in the late 1970s cuts off aid to the country. There's these kidnappings. They say they won't do democratic elections. It's a big mess in Nicaragua. Essentially, President Somoza of Nicaragua resigns and this group takes over. President Carter sees the writing on the wall and he realizes he has to work with them. Again, this is a proxy war and it won't even end until 1989. So, the Sandinista-Contras conflict is also known as the Contra War. So you may see that word as well, just Contra War. Like I said, President Carter wants to work with the group, but he loses the next election. So the next president is a guy named President Ronald Reagan. And in 1980, he is so anti-communist, as many presidents were at this time, and he wants to oust communism from Latin America because it's so close to America, obviously. So there are these factions of people still loyal to the old Nicaraguan president, and this group of people are known as the Contras. So President Reagan basically signs a directive that gives guns to the people who want to overthrow the Sandinistas. So he wants to support the Contras. This is going to destabilize the region. This is the United States getting involved in politics in other countries. The Contras are now being backed by the CIA, while the Sandinistas are going to turn to the communist bloc for financial assistance. This will lead to what is known as the Iran-Contra affair, where the U.S. government was selling arms to Iran and using the money to help the Contras in Nicaragua. It was a big mess and illegal under the Boland Amendment, which is more of an American history topic, and I'm sure you'll learn about it in American history. In the end, the presidents of several Central American countries get together, negotiate a peace deal, and Nicaragua decides to have a free election. And the widow of a newspaper editor assassinated during the Somoza years actually wins. She was not a Sandinista, so the Sandinistas lose. So for all the work the United States did, they fixed their issues themselves. So we did nothing. Now, the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. In order to dive into the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have to do some more backstory. There was a coup against the president of Cuba in 1952. Now, Cuba was a friend of ours. There was an American ally, and he decides to take over. This inspires, though, this guy named Fidel Castro to overthrow the American ally, because the American ally becomes a dictator. So Castro starts the Cuban Revolution, and he nationalizes all the American businesses and ends ties with the United States because he doesn't like the dictator. It makes sense. And he becomes friends with the USSR because the USSR is not friends with us. The president in 1960 of the United States, President Eisenhower, tells the CIA to go and get Castro. So in 1961, with $13.1 million of American money, obviously, they train a bunch of U.S. military in Guatemala, and they go into Cuba after attacking Cuban airfields 2 days earlier. They land on a beach called the Bay of Pigs, where they are met with a local revolutionary militia who is waiting for them. Oops. The CIA trained military, loses their strategic footing. It's embarrassing. And by the time it goes down in 1961, JFK is president, so he withholds all the air support. Problem was, when the plan was made in 1960, the CIA said they needed the air and the Navy. Well, now all they have is the Navy. So the CIA says they're going to lose. And basically, 3 days after arriving at the Bay, they lose. So they surrender to Castro. This leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which was a 13-day conflict between the U.S. and the USSR, where the U.S. discovered that the Soviet Union was putting missiles in Cuba. Cuba is like 90 miles away from the southern coast of Florida. It was really too close for comfort. So the reasoning that they did it was because the USSR realized that America was putting ballistic missiles in Italy and Turkey. So the two countries go through tense negotiations, and the US agrees to get rid of their missiles in Turkey, and the USSR gets rid of theirs in Cuba. And as a result of this whole mess, the two countries create a hotline, which is why Drake is dancing. It's basically known as the red phone, if you've ever heard of that. But one president could just pick it up and be put right through to the USSR. It no longer exists because we don't need a red phone. But at the time, we had one. It was literally just a red phone in the office that could pick it up and talk to each other. All right, communism was brewing in China for some time, but we all know that Mao Zedong really takes off with it. And in 1949, it takes all over China. Like it's a big deal. They win popular support by redistributing land to peasants and basically trying to make things equal for everyone. Here's Mao Zedong right down here. Like the Soviets, they created a 5-year plan, and in 1958, they created the Great Leap Forward, also known as the Second 5-Year Plan. This was Mao's way of increasing grain yields and bringing industry to the countryside, which sounds like a great idea. However, it was not as successful as originally planned, and they blamed bad weather for it and took little to no action to prevent the tens of millions of deaths that resulted from this. This made the Great Chinese Famine the largest in human history, with estimates ranging between 18 to 45 million people dying. In order to reinvigorate the people and get them back into communism, Mao started the Cultural Revolution in 1966. This was similar, though, to the purges in the USSR. They were scare tactics. It lasted until 1976, and as a result of it, it destroyed the economy. Millions were persecuted, and anywhere from hundreds to thousands, or maybe even up to 20 million people died. We don't have accurate numbers. Now, I put Iran on here, and it's very interesting, and I know you're going to read about it because I know all of you are clearly doing your readings. And I could tell you all about it, but I actually posted this video up here. And take some time to watch it when you go through the PowerPoint. It truly does an amazing job of telling you the history of the revolution. It's also the beginning of a film called Argo. Now, if you ever have to play this and your mom or dad are walking by, Argo has a lot of curse words in it. This scene does not. It's just the beginning. But if your parents do let you watch rated R films, they should probably watch it first. But if you ever do get a chance to watch it, please do. It does a great job. The ending's a little dramatized, but it is a really good movie. And it tells you about a really great scene or a really great moment in history. So if you get a chance to watch Argo, do so. But even if you can't watch it, this scene is safe enough for you to watch. It tells you about the Iranian Revolution, and it's a huge deal. Like 3 minutes, watch it, take notes. It will tell you everything. Now, I really want to tell you about this person whose name I'm really going to butcher. Mengistu Haile Mariam, leader of Ethiopia from 1977 to 1991. This is a big deal for kind of like my generation. So he was the chairman of this group called the DERG, D-E-R-G, that took power during the Ethiopian Revolution that overthrew their emperor in 1974. This emperor was a part of a dynasty that had ruled Ethiopia since the 13th century. All right, that's a long time. That's the 1200s up to the 1900s. So this guy, Mariam, makes himself dictator and tries to modernize the economy, which, by the way, was a feudalistic economy, through Marxism with land redistribution. When you're doing the reading, especially if you do AMSCO, you're going to read a lot about land redistribution. So he then does what is known as the Ethiopian Red Terror, which was where they basically took out any opposition. And just the name, you know it's not good. It's called the Red Terror. There was also a terrible famine in Ethiopia during 1983 to 1985, which brought the country much international attention. This was such a big deal when I was growing up, and I'm in my mid 30s, guys. So, I mean, everyone was talking about starving children in Ethiopia. There was always these drives to just drive money to that country because children were starving and dying. Anyway, this man ends up leaving the country in 1991 when his government basically dissolves. And when he leaves, surprise, the civil war that's going on there ends. He's actually still alive today, and he lives in Zimbabwe, even though he was found guilty in an Ethiopian court of genocide. He wasn't in the court when they did the case against him, so don't think that he was found guilty and then just left. So his government is estimated to be responsible for the deaths of anywhere from 1 million to 2 million Ethiopians. All right. So you guys have a basic knowledge of the Indian National Congress. The leader in 1920 of the Indian National Congress was Gandhi. Now, like all leaders, we learn more as time goes by, and he does have some issues, again, as all people we look up to do. There are statues of him in Africa currently that some groups want taken down, as his views on race were not progressive for the time. Some say he evolved over time, others disagree. You kind of have to do research on that and make your own opinion. But we can all, I think, agree that he did do a lot of good for India. Instead of an armed struggle, he was more for civil disobedience and was able to help get India independent from British colonial rule. He was also very big in the civil rights movement in America, even though he didn't do it. Martin Luther King learned a lot through Bayard Rustin, who went over and learned through Nehru, who of course worked with Gandhi and all that. So it's a really, really, really big deal that everything he did for India. All right. So Gandhi also wanted peace between the Hindus and the Muslims, though of course not all agreed with that. In the end, though, Hindus got India and Muslims got Pakistan. So you'll read about it. You'll need to know about the Muslim League. You'll also kind of want to know about Ghana and Algeria. They're also going to be decolonized after 1900. For Ghana, I already talked about Kwame Nkrumah. For Algeria, this was owned by the French. There was a feeling of nationalism, and the Algerian War for Independence began in 1954. The group that led the charge for independence was called the National Liberation Front, also known as the FLN. That's why it says FLN on here. They used guerrilla techniques to fight. In France, the president, I believe it was Charles de Gaulle, he actually planned in 1958 to get Algeria independent and went to the people in order to bypass the National Assembly. War breaks out anyway in Algeria in 1962, and many leave Algeria and go to France, which unfortunately created an anti-immigration sentiment in France. Many died in Algeria, and the FLN essentially won the war. Then in 1991, another war broke out there until 2002, and it wasn't until 2011 that a state of emergency was lifted from the country. So I put here, I told you that I would add a slide about Vietnam. I really do kind of want to have you watch this Vietnam clip at some point. Just try and watch it. Again, I think it's only about 2 minutes. So in your spare time, please try and watch that. So now I include this sign about Canada, and we're almost done, guys. Not just because it's in your reading and not just because it's a part of the College Board curriculum, but also because I just love the connection to today. Quebec had, and you could argue still does have, a separatist movement. They wanted to have their own nation. They even took part in bombings as a means to say they really wanted to be separate. Granted, in 1998, this country's Supreme Court said it would be very difficult for the process to go through, and in their last vote in 1995, it didn't happen, but it was a serious movement at the time. I wanted to include the picture, though, of the Prime Minister at the time because it's Pierre Trudeau, the current Canadian Prime Minister's father. So make sure you do read about this movement because, again, it's in your College Board curriculum. Everything we put in these slides is in your College Board curriculum. And the last thing I want to go over, this is the last thing for 8.5, just to really know the difference that there are some places that negotiated independence and other ones that went through armed struggle to get their independence. It really should know these places on a map. India, of course, is South Asia. The Gold Coast, I included here, is the map in the middle of Africa. The French West Coast will be all the way over here on the left. It's the blue one. And then Algeria is on the right side. Again, that's another Africa. Angola from the Portuguese and Vietnam from the French. So just kind of make sure that you're aware of kind of whereabouts they are. And of course, take some time to go through this PowerPoint. I apologize that it took this long. I'll try not to be so wordy, but try and break it up as much as you can. We've got some time because remember, we're going to combine 8 and 9 for this unit. And hopefully you got some good information out of this. All right, you guys have a great time. Okay, bye.